Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Elizabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University, where we are extremely pleased and honored to present an interactive conversation with U.S. Senate Majority Leader and New York Senior Senator Chuck Schumer. I'm Horace Anderson. I'm the Dean of the Haub Law School, and I'd like to thank Michael Romita, President and CEO of the Westchester County Association, and Jan Fisher, Executive Director of Nonprofit Westchester, for all of their efforts in organizing this event. We here at PACE are proud to be part of this rich opportunity to foster dialogue among the business, nonprofit, and education communities, state and local officials, and our longtime U.S. Senator. I'd like to extend a hearty welcome and thank you to Senator Schumer, as well as to a large number of officials who've joined us here today. I'd like to first welcome up Westchester County Executive George Latimer and thank him in advance for sharing with us some opening remarks. George.
Thank you very much, Dean. We're all very honored to have Chuck Schumer with us today, and he is not a stranger to Westchester County. We see him as much as we see each other on a regular basis, and we know that he is running the United States Senate at the same time. And we're obviously all very proud, Chuck, of the accomplishments that you've had in that role day by day over the course of your tenure. And we look forward to Westchester being a good partner for you. Many of your partners in government are here today, and my job is to recognize them very briefly. First of all, I've always thought that you can never have enough Senate Majority Leaders. So in addition to having the Senate Majority Leader of the United States Senate, we also have the Senate Majority Leader of the New York State Senate. Now, I'm working off of a predetermined list, and I have to use my best eyesight to try to catch anybody who might be here that's not on the list. I apologize in advance if I miss you. We have representatives from our state government who are with us here. We understand that new Assemblyman Matt Slater is with us. Assemblyman Slater. We have with us leaders in the Westchester County government. Deputy County Executive, my friend Ken Jenkins, is with us. The Chair of the Westchester County Board of Legislators, Catherine Borgia. We have the Vice Chair of the Board of Legislators is with us, Nancy Barr. Legislators Vedat Gashi, Jewel Williams-Johnson. And if any of the other 13 walk in, we'll catch them before the event is over. We're joined by the Mayor of the City of White Plains, where we are hosted by Mayor Tom Roach. And fresh off an important press conference in Yonkers, where Senator Schumer came to announce a great environmental initiative, the Mayor of Yonkers, Mike Spano. I'm pleased to have some key members of my executive branch with me here. Our Deputy Director of Operations, Emily Saltzman, is with us. We have our Director of Economic Development, Bridget Gibbons. We have our Director of Innovation and something else that I've forgotten at the moment, Deb Novick. Our Director of Administration, Chris Steers, is here. And our Workforce Development Group, Tom Kleiner, is with us here. I don't exactly know who is running the county government at this moment. Hugh Grecian, our Commissioner of the Department of Public Works, is with us here as well. And a special shout out for the man who spent most of last night at the airport dealing with this terrible tragedy that we had, our Commissioner of Emergency Services, Richard Wishton. If I have neglected some of our other elected officials, I do apologize. But most importantly, Senator, you always have a warm welcome here. We know you're a Brooklyn boy, but you always have a warm welcome in Westchester County. And the work you've done for us is exemplary. Thank you, and thank you for being with us here.
Thank you, Dean Anderson and County Executive Latimer. It's truly an honor to stand here today on the same stage as U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a fellow Brooklynite raised in the Midwood section, and to be here with my colleagues, Dean Anderson and Michael Romita, CEO of Westchester County Association, and all of you. Today's forum showcases some of what makes Westchester truly special and truly unique. The joining together of colleagues from business, nonprofit, higher education, and government sectors is really powerful and doesn't happen that often. When we work together, we realize that many of the issues that have often kept us siloed and have slowed down progress actually intersect and should never be separated. Workforce development and social justice, for example, must be part of the same conversations for our society to truly advance and to solve the pressing economic, social, and human rights issues of our day. When we come to the table as respected and respectful colleagues, great things happen for all people. It is with gratitude for my board of directors and the partnership with Westchester County Association and Pace University and our government partners that I welcome all of you here today. Thank you.
I'm just going to do it from the seat, but I also want to recognize Jan and the partnership that we have. Jan and I talk probably 3 or 4 times a week. And it's really important to have this collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. I do want to also recognize the members of our boards of directors, respectively, many of whom are actually graduates of Howe Law. Thank you all for coming and supporting the various organizations. Also, senators, the senator's staff. Anybody who's worked inside the Beltway knows who keeps the wheels turning. So Nicole Bergonia and Meg Glander, you guys are fantastic, and we need to give a shout out to the staff. So a little bit about how this is going to work today. The senator has graciously given us 4.5 hours of his time before we get to the next event. 3.5, which will be his opening remark. So the senator is going to give some opening remarks, and then we have curated questions that we've gotten from some of the members and other people who have signed up for the event on a number of various issues of importance, not only to the country, but also for Westchester County. Notwithstanding what you guys all read on cable news, it's actually been a pretty productive Congress that Senator has presided over the last term, with some might say landmark legislation being signed into law, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which we will try very hard not to keep referring to as the IRA, the CHIPS Act, and of course, the very last week of the year, a $1.7 trillion budget, which included a lot of additional information and goods and grant programs in it as well. So we're going to try and get to all of that. We probably won't, but we'll get as far as we can. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Horace Anderson to formally introduce the senator.
Thanks, Mike. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a fellow Brooklynite. Brooklynites dominating the panel up here. It's going to be hard for Mike to get a word in edgewise. New York Senior Senator Charles Ellis Chuck Schumer. Senator Schumer has dedicated his career to being a tireless fighter for New York. He has delivered countless large and small victories across the state, including delivering $20 billion to rebuild after the 9/11 terror attacks and passing a $63 billion relief package to help New York recover from Superstorm Sandy. From massive snowstorms in New York to numerous floods across the state, Senator Schumer has been there to deliver and support New Yorkers in their time of need. He has made it a hallmark of his career to protect the middle class and those working to reach it. From offering a permanent tax credit to offset the rising cost of college tuition, to protecting Social Security and Medicare, to encouraging job-creating infrastructure projects. Senator Schumer was born and raised in Midwood. If you don't know, that's in Brooklyn. He attended public school there before heading to Harvard University and then Harvard Law School. In 1974, he was elected to the New York State Assembly, where he soon made his mark with his relentless advocacy. In 1980, at the age of 29, he was elected to represent the 9th Congressional District, and I will add a personal note here, visited my 4th grade assembly. PS 114.
114, Canarsie.
114, Canarsie. Remsen Avenue, Remsen and Glenwood.
Right.
He fought for his constituents in Brooklyn and Queens for 18 years, establishing a strong reputation as a consumer advocate. In 1998, he was elected to the US Senate, where he has made improving New York's economy his top priority. He has worked to successfully retain New York jobs that were at risk of leaving and to attract many new firms to New York to create thousands of more jobs. He authored legislation that eliminated barriers that delay low-cost generic medications from entering the marketplace and led the charge to make college tuition tax deductible. His exemplary leadership of the US Senate was crucial in the recent passage of the new $1.7 trillion federal budget and of 2 new landmark laws, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, the local implications of which we will be discussing today. Senator Schumer has always been a strong advocate for education, and I want to offer a special thank you to him for his support for Pace University, including the new Pace Performing Arts Center in Lower Manhattan. Senator Schumer's career following his law school graduation is a shining example for our students of a life dedicated to public service. Please now welcome Senator Schumer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is great to be here. I want to thank my colleagues on this panel who do a great job. First, let me thank Dean Anderson, and just something we're all so proud of in New York, and I know in Westchester, and that is that Pace Law was nominated by, or not, selected by U.S. News and World Report to be the top environmental law school in the nation. I want to thank Jan Fisher. She went to Midwood. I went to Madison. We were rivals. I used to play them when I was on the basketball team. They beat us all the time. Our team motto at Madison was, "We may be small, but we're slow." I don't know, Mike, you didn't go to high school in Brooklyn. Dean Anderson got into Stuyvesant, which, so he didn't quite go to high school in Brooklyn. But I want to thank Jan Fisher, who does an amazing job at nonprofit Westchester, and Mike Ramita, who does a great job in WCA. Thank you, George. And as I mentioned, because we were both together in Yonkers a few minutes ago, New York and Westchester are the only place, I think, in America that have 2 majority leaders. So he does a great job for New York. And one thing I want to just note, I am proud and honored to have just been reelected. This is my 5th term. That's the record. No one, Senator Moynihan, who was a mentor to me, had 4 terms, but this is 5, so I'm honored with that. And I'm not going to get into all the details of everything here, because I know we're going to have a lot of questions, so I'll give a broader overview. But we were able, being majority leader does have advantages. Senator Moynihan used to decry the fact that New York was a donor state. In other words, we sent considerably more money back to Washington than we received. But last year, with the majority leader coming from New York, first time ever, New York no longer is a donor state. We got more money back than we put in. I know when the money goes to Latimer and to Andrea and our elected officials here, it's well spent because they're very careful stewards of that money and make sure it goes to where it does. So we did have an amazing, amazing 2 years. Most people regard it as the most successful legislative session since the Great Society 50 years ago, and some say even since the Great New Deal, because particularly on climate, where nothing had been done, we did, overwhelming, strong legislation. So it was a very good, and here's something I know about this. Of the 7 major bills we passed, 6 were bipartisan. So despite what you were seeing on television with the extreme MAGA Republicans in the House of Representatives, there still is a lot of hope to get a lot of things done in a bipartisan way. I think a lot of my Republican colleagues in the House will realize that if they follow these 20 extreme people, it's sort of like Thelma and Louise. They're going to follow them over the cliff. And I look forward to getting things done in a bipartisan basis. And we're reaching out already and talking to some of the more mainstream Republicans. It means we don't get everything we want, but getting something done is very, very, very important. One thing we did, one of the 7 major bills passed bipartisan, which I'm very proud of, is marriage equality. And you may remember, passed the House, and then some of my very progressive friends were saying, well, just put it on the floor of the Senate and they'll vote against it and we'll have a great political issue. And I thought, no, if we can get this done, even if we don't have the political issue and wait, and my 2 colleagues, Tammy Baldwin and Kirsten Sinema, who were leading the charge on that bill, said if we waited, they thought we had a much better chance of getting it done. I talked to Republicans, we waited and we passed it. And it's so much better now that we actually have the bill than have a political issue. I don't mind making a political issue when Republicans are intransigent. I sort of have 3 hierarchies. First, try to get it done in a bipartisan way. If you can, try to do it just with Democrats. The major IRA of the bill, the IRA, excuse me, Mike, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the most major climate bill passed in America ever by a lot. We're going to reduce, under this bill, I had to watch a North Star. We're going to reduce the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere by 40%. We couldn't get any Republican support. Unfortunately, oil and gas and coal are so fund a lot of their super PACs and everything like that we couldn't get anybody. But we did it on our own. And if we can't even get it on our own, I don't mind putting it on the floor and showing the division between the parties. But that's the 3rd priority, not the 1st priority. And I think we're going to try to do that again, harder though it may be, in the new Senate. One of the things I know so many of you were from the nonprofit world. I thought the nonprofits are so important to Westchester and to our whole metropolitan area. It's about 20% of the economy. And so when the bills early on came up like PPP and EIDL, I said, I have to include nonprofits. And there was a lot of resistance, but we did it. And so many nonprofits benefited and stayed in the program. These are things that really matter to people, you're helping feed people, educating people, dealing with mental illness and all these, dealing with the environment. Some of the things that our nonprofits do was vital to getting that done. Similarly, a large section of nonprofits is the arts. And the arts were suffering more than restaurants, more than anybody else, because there were places where people gathered. And we passed the Save Our Stages bill, which really funded so many wonderful arts organizations that would have gone broke because you couldn't gather. And so we got that done as well. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is going to have huge positive effects on the infrastructure in Westchester. Already, I've been able to come up with an agreement between Amtrak. I forged this agreement between Amtrak and the MTA so that you will get a direct ride to Penn Station from Metro North. And that's going to be a huge, huge difference. And there are so many other things, helping the airport, helping the Beeline buses, things like that, were vital. The CHIPS and Science Bill is going to have a tremendous effect on Westchester. This is a science center. And of course, IBM is here, and they're one of the leaders in all of this. And in fact, IBM, in collaboration with the University of Albany, this will be funded by the CHIPS and Science Act, is going to create, there's going to be one center in the country, that does the cutting edge research on the next generation of semiconductor chips. That's going to create tens of thousands of jobs, maybe hundreds of thousands throughout the Hudson Valley. And IBM is collaborating with the University of Albany and other institutions and other universities, other nonprofits. And it's going to probably work. I'm going to fight hard to get it in Albany, and we will. It's going to be huge for New York, and huge for Westchester. And you have so much, there's so much science here with so many great institutions, not only, but the Watson Research Lab in Yorktown, SEEK, which has more patents than there are people in this room, does a great job. Pace University Computer Science, Cyberport, they're going to benefit from that. The Inflation Reduction Act is really vital as well. And obviously, in terms of climate, but it's going to reduce people's costs. The Inflation Reduction Act, by the way, they gave it that name, we gave it that name, because it does reduce the deficit by $300 billion. All the folks who talk about the debt ceiling, you know, that we have to, we're lowering. We're actually lowering it, and the overall debt per year is going to, not the amount of new debt incurred per year is going down as well. But this was done, but it's also going to reduce people's costs. So there will be point of sale rebates and tax credits for electric appliances, for heat pumps, for energy efficient materials, for commercial building electrification. It is estimated that the average resident, it's probably higher here in Westchester, but the average resident will save $1,800 by 2030 because of the incentives to make our energy greener, but also less costly. Green energy is going to end up being a double benefit because of the incentives in these bills. And obviously, moving to electric cars is the same, there are incentives. And many of these incentives are saying, make this in America, which is a big change from the past and going to make a big difference in terms of jobs. And there were other things we could put into the IRA. Andrea and I, along with the mayor, I saw he came in, Mayor Spano. Oh, yeah, there he is. We're just over in Yonkers. You know, when they built the Sawmill Parkway, they cut off Southwest Yonkers from everywhere else, and the community suffered and deteriorated. I put in there a reunifying communities that have been divided up in the past because of environmental injustice. And we just announced we're pushing, myself, your Congressman Jamal Bowman, Andrea, and the mayor were there. George is almost at everything, but he was probably preparing for this meeting. But in any case, we're going to get some money to restore the Greenway and re-link up Southwest Yonkers with the rest of Westchester and the Bronx. Those kind of programs can be repeated over and over and over again. And so this science bill will really benefit everybody in a great way. The omnibus is mentioned. Not only did we restore the budget, but we made sure that the Electoral Count Act is in that. It's going to reform the Electoral College, so we won't have the same kind of problems that we saw in 2020. And in there are lots of money for our local governments and nonprofits. There's something called earmarks. They used to be a dirty word because they were done in secret and no one knew what they were really all about. We reformed it and made it public. Earmarks work. I know what Westchester needs better than a bureaucrat in Washington who's never set foot here. So some of the things that are in this earmark are $2.7 million for the Westchester County and Scenic Hudson to build the Route 9 Riverwalk, $4 million for Ossining to construct the Route 9 road diet, $1.9 million for New York Medical College to implement its equity and compassion in medical education, $825,000 New York Medical College to launch the Women's Institute for Science Entrepreneurship, $1 million for St. John's Riverdale to upgrade its emergency department. The list goes on and on. There is lots of good things that will help Westchester that I made sure were in this bill. So in addition to the ECA, in addition to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, so women who are pregnant are treated better. And one thing I'm particularly proud of, and I learned about this when I visited St. John's Riverside Hospital with Cheryl O'Brien, and insisted Cheryl was going to come. There she is. Hi. About one of the great tragedies in America, one of the things we should be most ashamed of, and that is the disparity in maternal mortality between people of color and white people. Listen to this. This is astounding. Regardless of income, a Black woman has a higher rate of mortality at birth than a white woman. So you could be a well-to-do Black woman. It shows the basic inequities built into the systems throughout the country. So there's something called the omnibus. We didn't get all of it, but we got a significant part of it. And that is, there'll be, for a full year, anyone on Medicaid and CHIP gets 1 year of maternal benefits while you're okay. So that's just a little taste of the things that we are going to try to do. I'm sure you'll ask us in the next Congress what to do, so I'll get to that later. I'm going to conclude. I have a couple more minutes before we get to the questions. I like telling stories. I'm going to tell you my family story, because this, many of you know me, but this is who I am and what motivates me. And I'll start off way back when. My great-grandfather was a famous rabbi in what is now Western Ukraine. And he was a devout man, and he believed devoutly in the Bible. And the first commandment of God to man in the Bible is be what God told Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, peru urbu in the original Hebrew. So he, believing that devoutly, had 18 children with one wife. They had arranged marriages. They started at 14 or 15. Okay. But the Jews in Eastern Europe, as many of you know, were poor because they were so discriminated against. They couldn't be a farmer. They couldn't be a carpenter. They couldn't go travel to this place or start a business. So all they did was study, and they were poor. So the three youngest, including my grandpa, were sent to America in 1892. Parenthetically, I'll get to my grandpa, which is the main part of the story in a minute. But when I told this story to my Democratic caucus, Byron Dorgan, a droll Norwegian American senator from North Dakota, said to me, he had 18 kids? I said, yes. He said, well, he wasn't just studying. The 15 stayed there. Just this is a little bit of it's a little bit involved in our policy and issues. The 18 stayed, the 15 stayed there. Grand Rabbi, my great-grandfather, passed away, but the great-grandmother was still alive. The Nazis roll into Western Ukraine. They tell all the Jewish people in the town of Chortka, which is where they lived. It's a town of about 20,000. There were about 600-700 Jewish people. They said, gather in the town square. And they asked my great-grandmother, probably the most well-known person of the community, to gather her entire family on her porch in the square. And she did. And 33 people gathered from age 85 to 3 months. And the Nazis said, you're coming with us. She said, we're not moving. They machine gunned every one of them. So when people ask me why I support Israel, and some say, oh, it's politics. Oh, I tell them I would have had a lot more aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, and nephews had there been in Israel, and they would have had a place to go. Now let's go to my grandpa. So he comes over, he's about 6, and he's supposed to be raised by an uncle, but the uncle's a ne'er-do-well. So grandpa sleeps in doorways, he steals apples from the push carts, never went to school, had to teach himself to read and write as a young adult. But one night it's pouring rain, or day, actually, it's pouring rain, and he sees all these people going into this nice building. And he says, oh, I'll go in and get dry. Not charging admission. What was the building? The building was the Labor Temple. This is fake. Built by the unions to teach the poor immigrants on the Lower East Side about the union movement. And it was their annual meeting, and they had 3 of the greatest orators of their day, Eugene B. Debs and Will and Ariel Durant. My grandfather stays there, listens for 6 hours, and he's thunderstruck. He becomes a union guy. He ends up in Utica, New York, working in the paper mills, He was one of the founders of the Paper Workers Union, not one of the top 3, but one of the top 50. So my dad is raised in Utica. World War II occurs, Pearl Harbor. He's a patriot. He enlists. They give him a test. He scores very, very high. And so they give him top secret clearance. They teach him radar. Radar was just being developed then. And of course, its main mission was to find airplanes. But one of the secondary missions was to find mountains. So the Allies were flying what's called the hump over the Himalaya mountains to supply Chiang Kai-shek, and these big C-45 and C-47 freighter planes would fly over the mountains. But the Japanese fighter planes, the Japanese Zeros, would pursue them, and they'd crash into the mountains because the mountains were enshrouded in clouds. So radar was supposed to help them see the mountains through the clouds. My dad flew 20 missions, helped perfect radar, was shot at constantly by Japanese Zeros, never hit. The only injury he got a parasite in the airfields in Burma, lost his hair. When I became a congressman, he called me. He said, "All right, now that you're a congressman, can I get my Purple Heart?" And I said, "It's not the parasites, Dad." But in any case, World War II ends. Grandpa comes back. My dad comes back. The family's starving. Grandpa lost his job as a union organizer. They didn't have that during World War II. And instead bought a little exterminating business in Brooklyn from a German American who thought the Nazis were going to bomb New York and this guy was moving to Montana. My grandpa's not a businessman. He's an idealist. He'd go into people's houses and exterminate and say, you're very poor. You shouldn't have rats and roaches. Pay me when you can. He told the 3 workers in his business how to form a union and ask him for more money. So when my father gets back, the family's starving. My father had to work in this horrible business, which he hated, for 45 years, first to support his parents and brothers and then us. My dad never complained. I never even heard him utter words of resentment. He passed away a year ago, November. I never even heard him utter words of resentment about people who were given a better break than him. He was a very bright guy. Had he gone to college, he, would have had a better life. But he's still here with me. Those of you who've been close to your parents who are gone now, you may know what I mean. And he taught me 2 values that shaped my life. One, always try to help people who need help. That's a noble thing. But second, he said, if you're undertaking a major project, look in your heart, make sure it's the right thing to do, and then persist and persist and persist. And if you don't give up, God will reward you and you'll succeed. Here we are. That's what shaped me during these last 2 years, has shaped my life. And we will continue, I think, as a society to persist and persist and persist and make America a more perfect union. Thank you, everyone. Took a little longer, but I wanted to. Yeah.
Senator, thank you for those words. I'm going to kick off the questions by grabbing something that you said about the Inflation Reduction Act. He's going to call it the IRA.
And I'm afraid of this question because he went to Cyrus.
Madison is a great school.
It was good.
Yeah. So built into the Inflation Reduction Act, are a lot of individual incentives.
Yes.
That are targeted for essentially climate action.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about any sort of broader incentives for government, for the business community, for nonprofits, and how you think those will impact the Hudson Valley?
Skip those here, but there are lots of incentives. There's a good list of them here that will tell businesses, if you involve yourself in green stuff, you'll get a lot of incentives. Now, one large thing, which is just enormous, is just there's deep incentives to convert our power to clean green power, solar, wind, water. Nuclear does get subsidies as well. That's controversial, but it's clean. But New York State is likely to become the capital of the world in terms of offshore wind production, because we have the right rock formations offshore. We have loads of people in New York City, Long Island, northern suburbs, that this electricity is accessible to. And so businesses, there are many different ways. New York's going to become a center. GE is making some of the wind turbines up in Albany. We have places to assemble them up and down the Hudson Valley. And all of this will be used. But there are specific incentives as well, and I want to find those here so I can read them, but businesses would. Okay, there's point of sale rebates and tax credits for electric appliances and energy efficient materials. So that means not only for the consumer, but for companies involved in this, this is a big incentive. Those of you in the real estate business, there are huge credits for commercial building electrification and efficiency upgrades. If you want to convert your building to be green, which will save you money in the long run because your electricity costs will go way down. Right there are deep incentives and you should look at those. There are credits to incentivize construction of extremely efficient single and multifamily housing. We have a desperate shortage of housing. If you want to make it green, you're going to get really deep tax incentives to get that done. There are obviously, we're going to try to install EV charging stations throughout the country for the electric vehicles. There are going to be, again, companies right here in Westchester, they're going to be involved in installing those and maybe not in manufacturing them, but maybe. And then, you know, incentives for the generation of renewable technologies like battery storage and homes. And now, by the way, nonprofits who get involved in this are eligible for the credits. You know, it's very hard for a nonprofit to get the credit unless it's refundable. These are. So, because they don't pay taxes. So it's, if you go up and down the line and someone mentioned Megan Glander, I think, thank you, Jan. She is a blessing to Westchester and to the Hudson Valley. She does such an amazing job. And if just call her, you all know where to find her because she's even more ubiquitous than I am. And she'll get you a list of all of these. I'm just touching on some of them, but they're deep and many and involved. The goal is to reduce carbon, the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere by 40% US by 2030. And you need a lot of deep incentives to get that done. They're just putting out the regulations now. And lots of nonprofits and companies that are involved in some of these things are very important. And so geothermal, you have Dandelion here in Westchester. It's a big company. How many it employs? Several hundred people, doesn't it? That's going to grow like tops. So that's some of them. There are many more. Okay.
Thanks for bringing that up. You may know that I started my career in the environmental enforcement section of justice.
Yes.
And we've partnered with PACE on something called the Clean Energy Portal. So if you don't want to call Megan, just go onto our website. And it's a online searchable clearinghouse with all of these programs and incentives to help businesses transition to a low carbon future.
And you say, look, it's like an electric car. There's a big tax incentive to buy an electric car. And, you know, you pay a little more, but the incentive in a few years, the incentive will make the cost lower. But then the cost of running your car is much cheaper day to day and month to month. So all of these things are going to reduce people's costs as well as make us green. The incentives are provided to get us over the hump of providing the new equipment, but then the low energy consumption makes it very worthwhile for individuals and businesses.
Senator, we wanted to ask you about the inflation part of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Okay.
Obviously, the law itself has scored lowers the debt because of a 15% minimum tax on some large corporations.
Yep.
And also additional funding for the Internal Revenue Service.
Yes.
The first bill out of the box by the new House was to pull back some of that money. So not so much the Inflation Reduction Act itself, but that law did follow over $7 trillion of spending to energize the economy in the wake of COVID and so on. Westchester is an incredibly expensive place.
Yep.
Businesses and residents are justifiably concerned about what's happening to inflation right now. What role do you feel that that Congress has played in potentially creating this inflationary pressure, and what should be done about it?
Okay, good questions. Well, first, in terms of creating the pressure, much of that, just about all of it, came from COVID. And there were two choices. We didn't have to increase the deficit, and the federal government would have done nothing. We would have had the Great Depression, and revenues would have been way down, and inflation and deficits would have been higher. 1/3 of our businesses probably would have gone under. Remember those dark days when no one was going out, no one was home? That would be gone. Our local governments, George can tell, Mayor can tell you that. If George were here, he would too. They would have had to lay off half their people. Most of the hospitals here in Westchester would have gone bankrupt. So no one was going into, they had COVID, but they weren't doing their usual hospital work, which is what brings them in the money. So there would have been a huge, so there was no choice. There was no choice. Having done that, we now have to make efforts to reduce that deficit, and that's what we're doing. The Inflation Reduction Act, I know I disagreed with him on voting rights and other things, and many of you do, but Joe Manchin gets a lot of credit in this sense. He would not support the original bill, one of the 2 or 3 reasons, 2 others I disagreed with, but this one he happened to be right, is unless we actually reduce the deficit. So in this IRA bill, Inflation Reduction Act, the reason it has that name is for every dollar we spend on all the things we spent that I mentioned, we have to put $1 into deficit reduction. And it reduced the deficit by about $400 billion. The proposal you mentioned that our Republican colleagues are opposed to, and this really burns my rump. It really does. So Donald Trump decided that if you were very wealthy and paying no money, and I'm not talking about people making, several $100,000 a year, but very rich or big corporation, you should no longer get audit. And his right wing, I'd like to do a personal, said there is more tax fraud among the earned income tax credit, which pays people who make between $25,000 and $40,000 in incentive to work than at the top level. So it turned out at the end of Trump, you had a greater chance of being audited if you made $40,000 a year than if you made $4 million. Okay? And you cut back dramatically on IRS agents. If you call them now, if anyone who's had to call them has gone through a nightmare because they don't have the agents, but it also cut back on the auditing. So we put in the bill, and this had broad support, including, the inflation hawks like Manchin, Warner. We put in a proposal that put $110 billion, I believe, to restore these IRS agents, but only to audit businesses and that made something like over in the several millions, and only the audit individuals who made over 400,000. It will reduce the deficit by about $600–700 billion. That's how much, and people should pay their, and it's not raising taxes. It's just saying if you're a very wealthy person or if you're a big corporation, you shouldn't pay a lower percentage tax rate than us. Middle class, upper middle class. That's one of the best things we can do. So they passed this bill, and the good news is the majority leader of the Senate is not going to put that on the floor. That'll reduce the deficit a huge amount, huge, without raising taxes. But we have to be careful. I agree with you. Inflation is a worry. We have reduced the deficit over the last 3 years by a significant amount, and we'll continue to be mindful of that.
So I'm going to jump into something a little more social justice oriented, but also really important in terms of our economy. We're still concerned in the nonprofit sector, and I think the business sector as well, because small businesses are so impacted by recent and historic crises in population health and climate occurrences that have shown to have a disproportionate impact in our immigrant communities, in our Black and Brown communities, small businesses. We know that this is historic in all spheres of life. But with this as the backdrop, we're still very concerned about the Mamaroneck flood risk mitigation project. And we want to know if you could please give us an update and your thoughts about how are we going to move this forward? And in other areas? Are there other initiatives
Right.
that you support or that you're moving forward that can reduce really the devastating impact of flooding and climate occurrences on our already most vulnerable businesses and people and families?
Yes, well, let me say two things. First, there's a whole lot of money in the IRA and in other places to deal with the kinds of flood impacts that climate change has created. And I was back visiting after, I forgot what year, but visiting Mamaroneck when the first floods occurred, about 10 years ago, was it? Okay, and you saw the Mamaroneck River and the Sheldrake River and all of that. And of course, since so many poor people's homes are built close to the plain and other better homes are higher up, they suffered the most. We've been able to get some real money into that, and the flood mitigation project there is going forward. There are a whole bunch of flood mitigation projects that we've worked on. But in reference to the specifics of your question, there's a huge amount of environmental injustice, as you said. And that's what we visited in Yonkers when they built the sawmill and cut people off. But it's happened in place after place after place, different ways. And so in the IRA bill, there is $60 billion, like 10 times more, to undo some of these environmental injustices by giving the poorest people a chance to mitigate the problems that these environmental injustices create, by making sure that some of the mitigation work goes to reconnecting communities. Another one I'm working on, you know, Robert Moses is famous or infamous for building the Cross Bronx Expressway. We already have a project to try and bring the communities that were divided back together by covering it over. It goes underground anyway, but we build a roof on it and build nice things, parks, stores, and things that the people needed. So we're doing that as well. There's a huge amount of money for environmental, to undo some of the great environmental injustices that are here. In addition to the standard types of money, mainly in the Inflation Reduction Act, to deal with flood mitigation, et cetera. It is becoming obvious to almost all Americans that climate change is real and having an impact, certainly on their children's lives, but even theirs, with the weather changing the way it is. And so we're going to probably be able to do more of this in future years, because it did have some bipartisan support. That's one part of it that did put in some bipartisan.
Senator, let's talk about regional infrastructure. You mentioned Penn Station access as a project that's moving forward. What are the other major projects that you think you need, particularly in New York and in the Hudson Valley? And in a divided Congress, how do you plan to move those forward?
Well, the good news is that we have allocated the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which now has some new initials, IIJA. I don't know what the hell it stands for. They call it that now. I don't know why. It has $1 trillion. Now, over the next, the money takes a while to get spent on these major infrastructure projects. And I got $60 billion for Sandy. Some of the Sandy money is still being spent now. And so there is going to be, over the next 5 or 10 years, a huge amount of dollars available for infrastructure projects. And I would recommend all of you, particularly those of you who are local officials or in groups that are dealing with these issues, to apply for it. Let me give you one example. We will get something like $300 million just for bike lanes and trails. That's a great thing in Westchester. I mean, I always liked how the Bronx River Parkway was closed off. I did that myself. I'm a bike rider. I am not a spandex guy. I'm not going at 40 miles an hour. But for every aspect of infrastructure, whether it's water and sewer, whether it's roads and bridges, whether it's railroad crossings, we put you have a big problem here in Westchester in railroad crossings. I remember visiting that horrible day after Valhalla where 6 people were killed. And of course, the Spite and Dival derailment that killed 4, I believe it was. There's money to fix all of that stuff. We have neglected infrastructure for 40 years. This bill, bipartisan, got about 70 votes in the Senate, has huge amounts of dollars. And there's another thing, again, I suggest, maybe it's on your website, but they haven't come out with the regulations, but I would commend both the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the public sector to look carefully and start applying. One of my jobs as majority leader, the first job is to get the money. passed into law. But the second part is to make sure that New York does really well in these projects. And we have so far. As majority leader, you know, the president calls me up every second day. Well, let's do this. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? So I say back, okay, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And it works out pretty well for New York. I know I'm leaving so much out, but we gotta, well, keep going.
I'm gonna jump back in with a question that impacts everyone, and that's affordable housing.
Mhm.
The affordable housing crisis in Westchester and the Hudson Valley looms large over the people served by the nonprofit sector. But to be clear, they are those people who come to the doors of nonprofits for healthcare, educational support, childcare, job coaching, domestic violence services, services for older adults and people with disabilities. Most are employed or underemployed by large and small businesses, government agencies, and the nonprofit sector itself and their family members. They are the working poor and the lifeblood of our economy, and some of whom are making decisions between paying their rent and putting food on the table. This is something we all need to care a little bit more about. How can government at all levels come together to address the housing crisis, which we know has impacted every other
I would
sphere?
say this is one of the areas that I'm still so disappointed in. When the president originally proposed a BBB, Build Back Better, the one that didn't go through in December of 2021, it had no money for housing. But using my ability as head of my caucus, where a lot of people cared about housing, we actually put $300 billion and put it into housing, which would have been huge. And frankly, and this was reconciliation, I can't blame the Republicans. Joe Manchin didn't want it in, you saw, and the bill fell apart. And the new bill we put together, he wanted some small amounts of money for housing, but not much. So this is an area, first, it's expensive. You know, I mean, as important as housing is, and it is, as important as anything, but it's easier to feed someone, to give them health care, and even to educate them than build a new house for them. So we're looking at what we can do in the new Congress. And the best thing we can probably do, well, we can try to tie some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and Manchin are interested in more rural housing where there's a desperate shortage. So we can probably tie some increases in housing money to rural. We did get some more money for public housing, but it's not enough. But the biggest thing we can probably get done is something that's probably built more low-income housing than anything else. And that is expand the low-income housing tax credit. That is a huge incentive that has built more affordable housing than anybody else. It does often get bipartisan support. And again, I want to say something about bipartisan support in a second. But that's where we're going to focus. We're going to see if we can get some real low-income housing tax credit money. We raised the cap under the leadership of Senator Cantwell of Washington State, who's been passionate about this, to 4%. We'd like to get it much higher than that. And that will probably, that's the most doable thing right now. I know that, you know, the state is considering housing incentives as well. And since they don't have the negativity that we have from so many others, that's important. But I would urge you, those of you in the housing field, and I know some of the real estate organizations in New York are doing this, to start pushing, especially with our Republican colleagues, the low-income tax credits. Really makes a big difference, and it's doable.
Senator, the governor has a very bold, aggressive agenda on housing in an area where actually the nonprofit community and the for-profit community have come together and are generally supportive of what the governor is proposing.
Yeah, I think the governor's proposal, I don't know the details of it, you know, Andrea knows it much better than me, but it's something that I think was a very smart thing to do, and we should push it. We should push it. We are, let me give you an example here. This does not mean Westchester, but it just shows you what we're up against, and it has spillover effects. New York City went from 8.1 million people to 8.9 million people between the 2010 and 2020 censuses, an increase of 800,000 people. This idea that people don't want to live in cities is not true, okay? But we only built 100,000 units of housing. So we had 800,000 net deficit in terms of providing housing. So the governor's plan is welcome. I don't know the details, I can't vouch for details, but the focus on housing is welcome. The one other thing could I importune you to do one other thing? I don't, maybe it'll be a question. Debt ceiling, were you gonna ask that?
Oh, you want to talk about the debt ceiling very neat at this time. I know that the staff wanted us to mention the CHIPS Act. There's a lot going on in New York State. You're bringing a lot of this money back home to
Yep.
New York State. There are ribbon cuttings, mostly upstate, although there have been some smaller funds for places like IBM and CQC here in Westchester.
Yep.
So the question is, how do we unlock more of the opportunity of the CHIPS Act for the local?
The CHIPS Act is, this is the CHIPS and Science Act. Semiconductor chips are essential to our economy. You know, the tire in your car has about 20 chips. That's how the thing on your dashboard says your tire is low. Do a chip. And didn't used to be able to do that. But that's just a small thing. We are dependent on chips. We've done all the thinking about chips and all the research about chips, but now only 12% are made in America. About 40% are made in Taiwan. That's a real security danger to America, because even though Taiwan is an ally, all you need is China to threaten Taiwan, and who knows what would happen. So we have to produce our chips, and now this was a passion of mine. There are two things in the CHIPS and Science Act. One is a huge investment to have chips manufactured here. We just landed, I worked very hard on this, the largest chip plant that will be built in the world on memory chips by Micron in Syracuse. And it's really important. I remember when Carrier pulled out of Syracuse, you know, the air conditioner was invented up there, it employed thousands of people, and the place was devastated. Now they have hope. We are trying to make every area a part of New York that is going to be involved in research, in science research, and then the spin-offs. Binghamton, no one knows this, listen to this. So, I'm so proud of this, and it'll help all of New York State. There's a Nobel laureate at Binghamton University. His English name, Whittington. He's an Englishman who came to the US. Whittingham, anyway. He got his Nobel Prize for inventing the lithium-ion battery. We have just gotten $100 million grant to make Binghamton one of the centers of manufacturing lithium batteries. You know, the Hudson Valley is going to have huge. We have onsemi that is going to expand the Fishkill plant. That's not too far away from here. IBM is going to be the center, as I said, of this national semiconductor center that will do the cutting edge research on chips. And IBM is the leading company involved in this. That's going to have huge effects, and they're going to be very, very at the center of producing these chips. And it's going to help them grow in many, many different ways. And because there is such a highly educated workforce here in Westchester, and because the Hudson Valley is a great place, many of these companies are going to grow right here. So this is a tremendous opportunity, because it's not, you don't have to build a $10 billion chip manufacturing plant. We have companies that are going to start making all the components that go into chip making. A vacuum company from Britain, the largest one in the world, just located in Rochester, but there's no reason they shouldn't be locating here. I would urge our economic development groups here in the county and in the localities to start looking at advantages with your well-educated workforce, with the proximity to these major advances in upstate New York and on Long Island. There's a real opportunity for this to happen.
Thank you, Senator. It's important for Jan and Horace and I to maintain a good relationship with your staff.
You know, here they are.
So we're getting pinged, and we'd like you to maybe do a short close, and then we'll thank everybody.
I could stay here. I could stay 4.5 hours. I
Well, you
enjoy
have to
things
come
like
back.
this. I'll come back, I promise. But here's the story of my life. So I'm swearing in your new assemblyman up in where? In Portland, Dana, in Portland. And then my wife, we live in Brooklyn, obvious, and she is head of the Prospect Park Alliance, which helps maintain Prospect Park, which was Olmsted and Vaugh's jewel, they say. And the reception starts at 6. So I have to go up to Portland, swear in Amy, and then go back to Prospect Park. And if I don't get there by 6, whether you invite me back or not, I may not be around.
Thank you, Senator.
Do it, but thank you, look, one of the greatest things about this country, you worry about democracy, which we do. It's only a small band of people who want to undo our democracy. They're only 3, 4, 5%. You know, social media has allowed them to agglomerate and do bad things, but it's not much. In the worst dictatorships in the world, it was small groups. What's the antidote? You, the participation of the public, not only in political life, but in business life, in nonprofit life, in civic life, and the involvement of people who don't shrug their shoulders is going to keep our democracy. I am an optimist, as my dad taught me. And if we just keep at it and doing what we're doing and making America a better place and realizing some of the inequities that we have to rebalance, as we've talked about, a few of which here today, this country will get better and we will beat back, you know, those handful of people who want to undo our democracy. So let me conclude by thanking you for being involved and for caring.
Thank you, Senator.